Good afternoon. My name is Alexander Zmeul. I am creator of architectural program of Mosbuild. Mosbuild is the largest building and finishing materials exhibition in Russia. And it's very big honor for us, for me, that our forum, that our program will open interview with Alex Ely, founding director of May office. And we will talk about trends in the creation of affordable housing. And we will talk about architectural, social, and economic aspects of this problem. Alex, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you, and thank you for inviting me to Mosbuild.
Yeah,
I thought
you.
Perhaps in response to your challenge of talking about modern housing development, I should share a presentation, share some principles that we're designing to in the UK and internationally.
Yeah, thank you. And then I will ask you questions, and I'm sure you will give us very interesting answers.
I'd be delighted to. Okay, so the question I was asked was about modern housing development, but really housing is part of the city. So I wanted to broaden the conversation to how we need to develop more sustainable cities first and foremost. And then I will talk about housing and how we need to create a rich variety of housing to cater for different demographics, different family household structures, different age groups, and different levels of affordability. And then I'll touch on ideas about improving the home itself, so dwellings, and how we can create really good home environments. And then I need to touch on environmental impact, because it's an imperative today that we reduce our carbon footprint and reduce the impact on the environment in order to try and mitigate the damage of climate change. So let's start with a reflection about sustainable places. Cities are very complex ecosystems. And the population of the world is, we all know, growing. 68% of the global population will be living in cities by 2050. And you can see from this graph that the rural population is remaining fairly stable, but the urban population is growing considerably. What does that mean? That means we're going to have to build more cities, possibly. It certainly means that our existing cities are going to have to expand. But it also means that we have to perhaps consider how we can design intensively and build very complex mixed-use developments within our cities, so that we don't end up with problems of city centres being purely for employment and leisure, and then sprawling suburbs and peripheries of cities being purely for housing. We need to think about how we can bring housing for living alongside offices for working, alongside buildings for leisure and play, bringing it all together. And this is really very much the idea of the walkable neighborhood. In many ways, it's how cities have traditionally developed. Before we had the luxury of cars and transport to easily get us to remote places. Today, we need to try and reduce our use of a car in order to reduce climate change and the environmental impact of pollution from cars. So we can do that by creating more walkable neighborhoods where we co-locate housing alongside local schools, retail and shops, even healthcare facilities, as well as places for employment and for work. So when we design housing, we try and not just consider housing itself, but try and think about housing as part of a microcosm of a city, ideally with all the facilities that you would want within walking distance of your home. So you can see from this diagram on the left that a sustainable city or community is made up of good transport, so good access to facilities. That could be walking or cycling or public transport. It needs good services in terms of community provision, so that could be social infrastructure, as I've just described. And it needs that social and cultural mix that makes cities enjoyable places to be. And it needs to cater for different economic needs. So some of the priorities for contemporary urban development today include thinking about the physical context. We need to create neighborhoods that have a density of population, so that the population is there to make the schools work and the shops viable. And with that comes density of built form. And I think we'll come on to a discussion about height and high-rise versus low-rise development. And we need to think about future-proofing. So by which I mean adaptability, allowing for our streets and our buildings to change over time, so that as our needs change, rather than demolishing and replacing, we can perhaps convert. And in Moscow, there are some fabulous examples of old industrial developments or old complexes that have been converted into new uses. And they have stood the test of time and provide very good, very attractive new places to live. So I've mentioned that we need to consider environmental impact of development. So for us, that comes down to trying to prioritize public transport rather than use of the car. You can get many more people on a bus that uses much less area than a private car, or we're promoting a lot of cycle provision in London these days to cater for cycling to work. And then importantly, we need to ensure that new housing development has good open green space for access to leisure that will improve health and well-being. And then, as I've mentioned before about the walkable city, we need to create diversity. And that means diversity of land use. So housing is complemented by other uses, but also diversity of tenure, so that we can cater for those who have different levels of income. And then we need to ensure that our places are sustainable and stand the test of time. So I just want to illustrate with an example how we're starting to bring some of these concepts together. And within a development that we refer to as a mixed-use urban block. And I'll expand on some of the qualities that we see within these neighborhood buildings. So a typical housing residential block can perhaps at the ground floor cater for uses like a community use, such as a nursery for children or a primary school. It could have a library and social infrastructure provision. So that can cater, or that can be accommodated on the ground floor where it's easily accessible from the street to passers-by and people in the wider district. We can then accommodate car parking within the depth of the building. So perhaps it means that there's less pressure on the roads to accommodate parking. And it means that buildings can come closer together so they have a much more intimate and human scale to the street. And then we need to make sure that we're accommodating uses for leisure. So play facilities for different age groups, whether that's basketball courts or football courts, skating rinks, and so on. And then we need to make streets attractive for people to enjoy, whether that's with markets or access to shops or outdoor sitting for food and leisure. And then above the car parking within an urban block, we could perhaps accommodate landscape for gardens, for in good weather, enjoying the outdoor life. And then, of course, we need to make sure our homes are attractive and comfortable to live in. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail about how we can improve dwelling quality. When we design housing, we always start with the experience of arrival. We try and design housing from what it must be like to arrive home. You want that sense of security, but also you want to arrive at a generous and dignified entrance. So if it's apartments, into a generous lobby. If it's a private home with a very clear front door off the street. But the arrival experience has to be one that we can enjoy. And then from the lobby, even thinking about how corridors into apartments, or in the UK, we're looking at gallery access decks, can all be designed to uplift and enhance your experience, not just for you to arrive home, but think about how you might meet your neighbors and enjoy a connection and a relationship with your the wider people within the building that you're living in. And then, of course, with apartments and housing design, we're always trying to design homes that are flexible. So the layouts can cater for different needs over time, for growing families, for privacy. We've all experienced during the pandemic that some of us have had to work at home. So how do we manage the privacy if our children are studying at home whilst we're trying to work? So we need homes that can provide that flexibility. And part of that consideration is quality of sunlight and daylight into the home. So we always try and design apartments that are dual aspect. So they get light from at least two sides of the building. That means it gets light at different times of day, but it also means that it can get naturally ventilated. So you're not reliant on air conditioning in the hot summer, and you don't overheat if you have, which you might typically have in a single aspect apartment. And then we need to be able to enjoy not just the quality of life within the home, but also outdoors as well. And increasingly in the UK, and certainly in London, we make sure that all apartments, at whatever level, whether it's affordable or market sale homes or even luxury homes, have access to a private balcony or maybe a roof terrace, somewhere that you can sit and enjoy the sun, maybe even plant vegetables or grow greenery and make it enriched in terms of biodiversity. And then just to conclude this sort of short presentation of some of the priorities we designed to, increasingly as architects, we need to acknowledge the impact that development has on the wider climate. And from this graph, you see that over time, our use of fossil fuels and our greenhouse gas emissions is rising, and energy level and use is rising. And a large portion of that comes down to residential and commercial use. So we need to try and find ways to mitigate and reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. And when we're building, we need to recognize that actually 72% of greenhouse gas emissions that come from buildings are during their lifetime. So they come from heating and the energy used to power our homes. And then 28% of carbon emissions come from the actual materials that make up our homes, so the concrete or the bricks or the timber. And it has to be our objective as architects to try and reduce both. And we can do that a number of ways. We can try and reduce the energy used in our homes or transfer it to renewable sources of energy, such as wind energy or solar